I wanted to bring in this afternoon some folks who know a little bit more about the subject matter. So we're going to have a presentation focused on California permitting, another short presentation focused on wetland definition and 404, 401, and then I'll come back after that and just touch a little bit on the California monitoring, surface water ambient monitoring program that we have. So that's sort of what's on tap for the next hour max, but we'll see how far we actually go. Okay.
All right. We ready to start? Great. So it's the end of the day, and this is your third day, I believe, right? So we're going to kind of lighten things up a little bit, I hope. My name is Diana Messina. I've been with the state and regional water boards since that survey with Hyperion and so forth that Terry was talking about, the early 90s. And I was with the State Water Board when the first inland surface water plan was developed in the 90s and then challenged and then put aside. And then the California Toxic Rule came about and our state implementation plan. And basically a lot of what you folks already know and have been learning in these last few days. And so I am introducing Afrouz Farsimidin. She is my program manager over the statewide NPDES wastewater unit. She is going to give an overview of our state and regional water board permitting programs when it comes to NPDES. The main thing, though, that I want to say is that everything you're learning in regards to standards and criteria are not self-implementing. So the water boards cannot enforce against any discharger unless these standards and criteria are implemented either in a permit or an order, which includes like a 13267 order or a cease and desist order. But mostly we implement our criteria and standards through permits. And that includes 401 certifications also. So with that, I introduce Afrouz Farsimidin, and I'll be on the sideline, and if there's any questions, we're both happy to answer.
Thank you. The one mic is for the recording, and that mic is for the PA system in the room.
Oh,
so,
two
mics.
Need both.
Two mics.
And we all learned on the first day that it's over there too, if you need to actually see what's on your slides.
Okay, perfect. My presentation is a very high-level overview of the NPDES and waste discharge requirement permitting in the state and regional water board. I'm not going to go into any details. Here at the state water board, the State Water Board issues and develops statewide NPDES and waste discharge requirement orders addressing water quality, drinking water, and water rights. We also manage our statewide public databases and provide funding for the drinking water and clean water projects. The 9 regional water boards issue their region-specific permits. They have individual permits and regional general permits to regulate discharges in their regions. They also issue regional-specific policies, permits, and regulations. The State Water Board here at the Division of Water Quality, currently we implement several NPDES permits. We regulate discharges from pesticide applications, utility vaults, sanitary sewer systems, natural gas facilities, drinking water systems, and we also have the industrial and stormwater construction general permits. We have a different unit in our division who issue and implement waste discharge requirements orders. The State Water Board permit implementation includes receiving applications from discharges, reviewing them, and issuing notice of applicability for approval of the permits. We also manage electronic reporting to our databases, and we have data review groups who work on making sure that our data in our databases are of high quality. We work with our Office of Information Management and Assessment and also DIT to maintain our public databases. Our section manages 2 databases, CVIX and STORMS. And we also have to report to the US EPA database, so we work with DIT on making sure that the data transfers correctly. The regional water boards issue their region-specific permits. They also, sometimes they have to issue general permits for their regions, and they permit the wastewater treatment plants, industrial facilities, and they have permits for phase 1 stormwater permits. Regional boards are also responsible for enforcing orders. They, in addition to enforcing their region's orders, they also enforce statewide permits too. The state and regional water boards collaborate on developing and issuing statewide regulations and permits. Some examples on the collaboration is the state implementation policy, development of the statewide toxicity plan, and stormwater cost guidance. We also have to make sure that our permits are compatible. For example, we have to make sure that the 401 certifications are compatible with the Caltrans and construction stormwater permits. Another example is that we have to make sure that the statewide construction stormwater permit and regional board individual dewatering permits are compatible. Sometimes the State Water Board issues statewide permits to help the regional boards with their workload, so they don't have to issue their own permits. We must address emerging issues in our permits. The State Water Board has adopted several regulations, such as resolutions addressing the cost of compliance, human right to water, open data portal, and climate change. We have to make sure that we address these in our statewide permits. We have to also consider statewide regulations and policies in our permits. We have to address new legislation, the statewide low cost guidance, and necessary fundings. We also have to address the quality and accessibility of data. Here is our entire permitting team. The state and regional water board staff work with each other to develop permits. We include environmental groups and environmental justice representatives, the enrollees. We work with professional associations and also with other state agencies and the US EPA to develop our permits. We have a very extensive public process before we even start drafting permits. We hold public outreach workshops and invite stakeholders to our meetings. And we also hold focus meetings with interested groups to get their feedback on our proposed regulations. After we have a draft permit ready, we post it for public review and comment, and depending on the complexity of the permit, we allow 30 to 45 days for public review. And after that public review period ends, we receive all the comments. We respond to comments, and based on the comments that we have received, we revise the draft permit and take the final permit to our board for consideration of adoption. Here are a couple of
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned that it's a permit that's reviewed by public. Which permits? Individual one or
All of them.
Regional?
every permit and every policy that the state and regional water boards develop, they have to go through the public review process.
One more question regarding the previous slides. If we have, for example, individual permit and then regional permit, if individual permit is more stringent than regional one, how the permit is managed then?
Sure. So again,
Usually it's overlapping each other sometimes, maybe the same which permit it's under top priority.
Correct. So
Thank
the
you.
question is, if at a regional board there is a regional general permit and there's an individual permit, which one supersedes? So an individual permit has a specific discharger or dischargers named. Typically the general orders at the regional boards and even the general orders at the state board are general orders for people to come in and get regulatory coverage if they do not have an individual permit or a specific permit for their discharges. So there should never be a time where there is more than one NPDES permit or more than one set of waste discharge requirements that are regulating the same discharge. Correct.
You can refer to these websites if you're interested to learn more about our NPDES stormwater and wastewater permitting, as well as waste discharge requirements programs in the State Water Board. That's all for me. Any questions? Thank you.
you know, I'll just add, thinking about the statewide water quality control policies that I highlighted on our first afternoon, the one that really applies to NPDES permit, I think, is probably the what we call the state implementation plan, policy, statewide implementation policy, just policy. And that handles how we do reasonable potential analysis, how there's a few other components in that really highlight some of our statewide development of NPDES permits. So that's the one to look to for that. Anything else, Diana, that you would recommend? Just it's good to know about.
Yes, and I'll just take a minute, not take away from the other speakers. So there is a distinction with the California State Implementation Policy. The states have a certain level of discretion. So you have probably learned a lot of probability-based or statistic-based measuring of water quality. Back in 2000, the State Water Board chose to adopt the state implementation policy and made the specific decision that reasonable potential was going to be based on actual observed data, not on statistically projected water quality. And so that's one of the main differences between the US EPA technical support document guidance and our state implementation policy. And the state implementation policy only applies technically regulatorily to the California Toxic Rule priority pollutants, but many regional boards and the state board use it as a guidance for non-priority pollutant criteria. And that policy also does not apply to stormwater discharges, but the overall concept many times is used by the state and regional boards when we do read our permits.
It's really helpful. Thank you. All right, Paul, you're up next to bring us into wetlands in 404-401.
Okay, so hey, my name is Paul Han. I'm the section chief for the Watersheds and Wetlands section. I'm here on behalf of Anna Maria Signs, and I'm going to move over because this isn't working. Anna Maria couldn't be here today, so I'm taking over kind of as a last minute. So if I make some mistakes, please bear with me. I've been asked to provide a California perspective on the 401 program. I understand that Joe Morgan, who I don't see, I see a sign over there. Is he in the room and I'm just not seeing him? No, he had to go. Oh, he had to go, okay. So I understand that he gave you a talk earlier today about the federal perspective on the 401, and I want to give you guys the state perspective. And I'm going to try and keep tying it back to water quality standards, because that's really what you hear about. I do want to say that most of my talk this afternoon is going to be focused on discharge of dredged or filled materials. Those are the type of activities that might require a 404 permit by the Corps of Engineers. And that's the program that I work in. So most of this talk is going to be focused on that and some of the changes we've made to 401 certification, permitting for dredged or filled activities in the last couple of months, actually. But be aware that, as Joe would have mentioned this morning, 401 certification does apply to more than just the 404 permit program. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about may apply to other programs, but make sure that you talk to those other programs before you assume that. Yeah. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between waters of the U.S. and waters of the state. So it's important to note that the 401 certification program is focused on waters of the U.S. It's also important to note that the definition of waters of the U.S. has been in flux for many, many, many years. And I anticipate will continue to be in flux for many years to come. It does not include a number of water bodies that are considered waters of the state. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Our state authority instead comes from Port of Cologne, which includes a much broader definition for what a water of the state is. For example, an isolated wetland and vernal pool may not be a water of the U.S., but they would be a water of the state. Many projects that come through may get a permit that affects a water of the U.S., but they may also have waters of the states that are impacted. In some cases, the federal agency that's doing the permitting action that would require a 401 certification may not be looking at both the waters of the U.S. and the waters of the state. So it's important that you as staff recognize that there is that larger world of waters of the state that may extend beyond the federal jurisdiction. And just to explain the graphics there, obviously it's a Venn diagram where all waters of the U.S. are waters of the state, but not all waters of the state are waters of the U.S. And the waters of the U.S. bubble is fuzzy because it represents the fact that that definition of waters of the U.S. is in flux. So in April of this year, we adopted new procedures to address discharges of dredged or filled material to waters of the state. This policy that we adopted was important for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is historically California has lost in excess of 90% of its wetland resources, and we need to be reversing that trend. We wanted the procedures to accomplish a number of things, of which we wanted to make sure that we provided consistent statewide definition for wetlands that covered the breadth of California's biodiversity. We wanted to establish consistent regulatory process to protect those resources. Prior to the adoption of this procedure, each of the regional boards had their own processes and procedures for adopting 401 certifications and for permitting dredge or fill impacts to non-federal waters of the state. We wanted to provide some statewide consistency to that process. We wanted to provide a single process that would apply to not only waters of the U.S., but waters of the state. So we had a lot of applicants that, and this was one of the things that we had to go back and forth about it. Do we just focus on those things, those gap waters, those things that fall in the light blue that are the non-federal waters of the state? Or do we have a single procedure that's going to be applicable to everything? And we decided that in the long run, it was better for applicants if they had one procedure to follow. So we wanted that as a goal. We wanted to have a single procedure that would cover a water, whether it was a water of the US or whether it was a water of the state. And lastly, we wanted a program that could adjust to future waters of the US definitions because we don't know where that's going to land. So the procedures have a number of different elements. There's three that I want to highlight for you that I think will be important to you as you're thinking about standards and water quality objectives and how those apply. These are going to be of interest to you even if you never process a 401 certification, because some of these apply to not just the 401 program, but to other programs at the water boards. So specifically, we provided a statewide definition for wetlands. This is important because many beneficial uses and many water quality objectives are specific to wetlands. So it's important to know what a wetland is and what it isn't. So the federal definition has what's called a 3-parameter definition. You got to have 3 basic things. You have to have the right hydrology, you have to have the right soils, and you have to have vegetation that is adapted to live in saturated soil conditions. That's great. It doesn't quite capture the breadth of biodiversity in California. The federal government handles this by issuing regional supplements. We thought rather than trying to figure out how to write our own regional supplements that we would just modify the definition to reflect the full diversity of California. So what we did is we modified one of those parameters. So for the state wetland definition, you still need to have hydrology, you still need to have soils. For vegetation, it either needs to be hydrophytic vegetation or it needs to be no vegetation. And that's to capture things like mudflats, which is shown here, or vernal pools or some playas. Okay, so those are some examples of features that don't fall under the traditional federal wetland definition that we are capturing under our federal definition. It's important to note that if you are a 401 practitioner and you apply the federal definition as adjusted by the regional supplements, in the vast majority of cases, we are going to end up at the same place. So there's a certain extent to which we're just getting to the same place the Corps would get to in a little bit more direct manner. If you're some of our more contentious stakeholders, you probably disagree with that statement. The one thing that's important to note that our definition, and frankly the federal definition too, can capture a number of features that we have not and have no intention of regulating, have not historically regulated for dredge or fill activities and would not intend to regulate in the future. A few examples of that. A bioswale that sits in the middle of a commercial parking lot. Okay, that's not something that we have historically applied dredge or fill regulations to, nor do we intend to in the future. A tailwater pond at the end of a field, or perhaps an active gravel mine. Now, all of these features might have NPDES permits from the discharge from that feature, but modifications to that feature through dredge or fill activities has not, and we do not intend in the future to require permits for those. So to address this idea that there are features that meet the technical wetland definition but are not what we want to regulate as waters of the state, we introduced what's called a jurisdictional framework. And it's basically a series of yes or no questions to determine, does this wetland feature qualify as a wetland water of the state? It's analogous to how the Corps does it. Okay, now when we talk about an application and some of the rules that we established in the procedures, again, trying to focus this back towards what you guys are thinking of in terms of standards, there are some things that we require. When Joe talked to you this morning, he, at least his slides, talked about a number of things that a certification processor should determine when evaluating 401 certification. He talked about things like effluent limits, he talked about water quality standards, those type of things. Did you pay attention to the last one that he would have mentioned, which was any other appropriate tribal or state requirements? Mm-hmm. Okay, so for California, that would include things like Port of Cologne, right? First and foremost. It would also include things like governor's executive orders, such as the 1993 Wetlands Protection Policy or the 2016 Water Action Plan. It would also include water quality control plans. So your basin plans are things that a water quality certification processor needs to consider when processing that 401 certification. So when we wrote these procedures, we specifically flagged some of these. One of those is delineation of non-federal waters of the state. I already talked about that, I won't say much more about it. But we also talked about the need to consider alternatives analyses. Now, the Corps of Engineers requires alternatives analyses in many cases. Our procedures will require alternatives analyses in other cases. For those of you who aren't 401 practitioners, an alternatives analysis is analogous to a CEQA alternatives analysis. They have a slightly different process and a slightly different endpoint, but you can think about it more or less the same way. We also require, consistent with the governor's executive order on climate change, an evaluation of how climate change might impact the mitigation proposed for wetland fills. We also require that impacts and mitigations be considered within the context of the larger watershed. So we talk about watershed planning, we talk about watershed profiles. Some of these are pretty similar to what some of you will work on with TMDLs. It's that same kind of idea of looking at the water body within the context of a larger watershed. And lastly, we talk about the need for mitigation of impacted resources, including a minimum mitigation ratio of at least 1:1 for compensatory mitigation. So these are some of the things that are included in our procedures. I want to flag that the procedures were adopted in April, but they don't become effective until 9 months after OAL approval. We anticipate going to OAL for approval this month. If we get OAL approval within the 30 days that's typical for OAL, we will be in a position to have the procedures effective in May of next year. In the meantime, we are developing guidance for staff and for external permit applicants, and we'll be doing that at the beginning of 2020. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So when you were talking about the state dredge and fill wetlands procedures, so are we talking about 401 certification, and that would presume a 404 permit is at issue, or do these procedures also apply to waters where there's no federal agency action?
Yeah, these apply to both, because again, there are projects out there that are going to, there aren't many of them, with the current proposal on the table that's being put forward by the current administration, the Corps of Engineers jurisdiction could contract greatly, and in that case, there may be more of them. But there are projects out there that impact only waters of the state. Right now, they represent about 5% of our overall workload.
Okay, so but necessarily you wouldn't be looking at a 401 certification, you're looking at a waste discharge requirement?
Correct. We permit them under our Port of Cologne authorities as a waste discharge requirement.
Okay.
Terry, I think you were first.
I was just curious, the 9 months after, why that timeline? What is driving that?
It gives us enough time to develop additional guidance and do the internal training necessary,
so
and there's always an element of negotiating with the stakeholders.
Oh, okay.
And non-wetland waters stay the same? These changes don't apply to non-wetland waters, like rivers above the high water mark?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so I didn't, this is a little nuanced. Our procedures can be broken down into two parts. The first part talks about what's a wetland and is a wetland a water of the U.S., water of the state, and how do you delineate it. That's kind of the first part of our procedures. The second part of our procedures is how do you process a 401 application, or in the case of a water of the state, a non-federal water of the state, a waste discharge requirements for that dredge or fill activity. That part of the procedures applies to wetlands and non-wetlands. Okay? over here. There was a question over here. If not, Stacy?
What's the State Water Board's policy with respect to if a regional board is poised to act on a 401 certification that State Water Board has interest in? Perhaps maybe there's some political pressure or issues, or what's the interplay between whether the regional board or the state board ultimately gets to issue?
Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to the attorney for the specific line item in Port of Cologne. But in general, the regs are set up so that projects that cross a regional board boundary are permitted at state board. So those are projects that affect more than one regional board. Projects that are exclusively within one regional board are permitted by a regional board. They are of course subject to the petition process. I am unaware of any ability for the state board to specifically come and grab a permit in absence of any petition. But I'll turn that back to the attorney to tell me I'm wrong.
Just a nuance on that. I think that's probably accurate as to dredge and fill permits, but if your permit is related to a diversion of water to beneficial use, or if it's related to a FERC licensed facility, then it would also go to the state board.
Yeah, this is
through
where
the water rights
Yeah,
division, not the water
I'm talking
quality.
about
Yeah.
it particularly from the lens that I have some expertise in, which is the dredge or fill portion. 401 certifications do apply to other areas. As you mentioned, water rights is a big one of those areas on FERC licenses, and there are some differences there. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you for your time. This was fun.
Okay, guys. Last little bit. I don't have too much to share with you. I doubt I will take the 20 minutes that's left in the day. Mostly I want to make everybody aware of some of the California monitoring stuff, kind of following up, Terry, on your presentation just this afternoon. And we have a pretty awesome statewide monitoring effort called SWAMP, which is one of my favorite acronyms, the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. And I pulled just a few slides of information from their webpage because it's good to know what we have up there and available. So you can learn a little bit more about the reason behind SWAMP, and we've had some California legislation that's established it over the years. Some of the statewide and regional monitoring programs that we have, they have a whole section dedicated to getting the data in to what is the California Data Exchange Network, or CDN. And we're working more and more on displaying that data in a way that is easy for all of us to interpret. And there's a good section on citizen monitoring and just some miscellaneous other stuff as well. So I think almost every region has a SWAMP coordinator. You probably all know who that is. Get them to take you out every once in a while. It's always a good thing. In fact, some of you are SWAMP coordinators. Who's the SWAMP coordinator for your region here? Yeah, one. I should have you come up and do this for us. So I wanted to touch on some of SWAMP's priorities. I did mention that there's a regional monitoring program, there's the citizen piece, there's a regional monitoring program, and then there's the statewide monitoring program. I think about half of the funds are split to all the regions, and then half goes to the state. Is that about right, Terry? So each of the regions has the opportunity to identify what your high priority monitoring needs are. Sometimes that's there in which to do source assessments for TMDLs, or I'm sure some's probably being used to respond to the fires that have happened over the last few years. So that's a really great place to look. If you have any waters that fall within category 3 of your integrated report and you don't know if they're impaired or not, those are good to start thinking about whether or not to use your regional monitoring dollars to do additional data collection and assessment on. Statewide monitoring programs have been focused kind of in three categories, which is the safe to eat, the safe to swim, and is it safe for aquatic ecosystems kind of questions. And so under the safe to eat statewide, there is a bioaccumulation monitoring program, or BOG, to go with the swamps. We have BOG. And that's really looking at mercury in fish tissue in a lot of our lakes. I would say that's the primary place that the primary monitoring that's being done under BOG. With Safe to Swim, we are looking at the freshwater cyano harmful algal blooms. And that's a little redundant, isn't it? But that's some of both the lake and the river monitoring that's happening there. And then a lot of the bacteria pathogen monitoring coordination. We have beach water quality work group meetings that many of the coastal counties, the environmental directors or the public health directors participate with us on to do bacteria monitoring up and down the coastal counties, and we're starting to work on getting some inland beach water quality work groups going as well, to look at bacteria. Also, cyanohabs are starting to pop up there. And then there's some programs that are really focused on aquatic life, the bioassessment program, again, back to all of our aquatic insects and macroinvertebrates that I spoke to a little bit yesterday. And our stream pollution trends monitoring program, or SPOT, which is sediment contamination focused. You probably have one or two, maybe more than that, SPOT sites. It's some of the estuaries or lower portions of your major rivers in almost all of the regions.
Rebecca, I'll just talk loud. What does SPOT actually stand for? Because it doesn't stand for
Stream pollution trends. Creative. It's creative. Must be the end of the day. So I said that there's also a focus on data quality. We have statewide quality assurance program plans in place that are really important as we're starting to do the sampling to make sure that we know how to identify a site, that we have calibration on the instruments that we use, that we know how we're reporting the data, that we got the right chain of custody and data transferring rules all worked out. So that is on more of a state level, and then you should also be aware that there is a need for quality assurance project plans when you're doing individual sampling projects. And there's a lot of information, again, on that first webpage to help do all that, and there are swamp staff that can help you create that as well. The data storage, our primary database right now is the California Data Exchange Network. Whoops. Oh my. And so CDN is linked through directly to the federal database, the Water Quality Exchange Network, which Terry was mentioning. So we pull directly from CDN when we do our 303D, 305B integrated report assessments. The beach water quality data right now is uploaded into CDN, then all of this goes over to WQX. So we are now working more and more then on the data display end on how to then pull from that in a map format or in a table format or a graph format so we can see the data a little bit better. And I know that the Office of Information Management and Assessment, OIMA, under Greg Gearhart, really is the team that drives all of SWAMP. And they're working on improvements both to CDN and to data display tools to make it easier to get data into as well as pull data out of. And I'm looking forward to it being a little bit more user-friendly. These are some of the data display tools that they're starting to work on. You see a lot of them in what we're calling our portals, the My Water Quality portals. And again, we've been trying to frame them in terms of is it safe to swim? Is it safe to eat the fish? And this is going to give you some summary data from some of those programs like the BOG, the bioaccumulation program, and the safe to eat portion. So look to these, if you ever want to play around for a little bit over your lunch hour and see what some of the data is. It's a really, these things are starting to look better and better and tell us better and better stories. And that's it. One thing, though, I do want to say before we conclude that I was thinking as we were going through this today is how excellent of sources we all are for each other. One of my goals through these presentations is to make you guys aware of the what we have within California, not so much the how or the when, but the what and the where you can find it. And I was thinking how much the where you can find it is all of us in this room. So I'm just kind of enjoying hearing some of the conversations that are happening and knowing who the right lawyers are for the right projects and who's working on what in what regions. So always be willing to ask each other as we go. Any other questions on what we heard today from a California perspective that you're dying to ask? All right. Well, then I guess we're concluded until tomorrow, 8:30 again tomorrow. All right. Thank you all.